At this time, I would like to turn today's program over to Kathy Eidelberg for the Siegel Company, who will be the moderator for today's web call.
Thank you, Heather. Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As mentioned, I'm Kathy Eidelberg, and I will be the moderator for today's webcast. To all of you who have joined the webcast today, we want to thank you on behalf of NAGDA. The PowerPoint presentation for today's webcast has been posted on the NAGDA website. If you want to have a hard copy of the PowerPoint in front of you and have not yet downloaded it, you can access it on NAGDA's homepage at www.nagda, that's NAGDCA.org, and follow the link in the News and Events sections located in the middle of the homepage. We have a very short series of housekeeping announcements. First, NAGDA appreciates the support of our 2013 NAGDA-CAST sponsors, ICMA-RC, VALIC, Prudential, Great West, Manning Napier, and Nationwide. Thanks to all these industry sponsors. Today's NAGDA-CAST is worth 1.5 continuing education credits for INFRE's CRA, CRC, CPE, and CFP designees. NAGDA will provide INFRE and the CFP board a list of all participants. If you will be seeking credit, you must have registered with your contact information and be logged into the webcast using your information. Individuals from the same venue that will be seeking credit must all participate separately. NAGDA-CAST participants seeking CPE and CFP continuing education credits must complete the polling questions during the webcast to receive credits. Finally, we need your input on how we did with this NAGDA-CAST and what we can do to improve it. So at the end, when you exit the webcast, a very quick, easy to answer NAGDA-CAST evaluation will pop up. We ask that you take an additional 2 to 3 minutes to complete this survey so we can determine if we are on the right track with these programs. Our speakers today are Joshua Franzel, PhD, from the Center of State and Local Government Excellence. The SLGE was started in 2007. Its primary focus is to help state and local governments be competitive employers. Among other topics, they focus on retirement issues. Paula Sanford, PhD, is with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, University of Georgia, which is the oldest and longest institution of government. Carl Vinson was a Georgia congressman who was in office for about 50 years. A complete bio for the speakers is available on NAGDA's website. We gave you the address before, under the NAGDA-CAST web link on the home page. With that said, let's get started. The focus of the report that we're talking about today, Evolving Role of Defined Contribution Plans in the Public Sector, focuses on changing workforce and fiscal conditions of government. Government's revision to their core pension plans, reduction in workforce, which we have seen all across the country, evolving compensation philosophy. Looking at benefits as part of the overall compensation and looking at overall total compensation, at how it works into the budgeting process and the percentage of budget that governments are looking at. All of these things are under review, and we have seen over 40 states make revisions in their core defined benefit plans in just the last 2 years. So what's this impact of rethinking of benefits and compensation? When we look at the types of changes that have been made, we see that the income replacement reductions from traditional pension plans, in other words, the core DB plan is likely to be replacing less income in retirement. And what does that mean? It really means that there's an increased importance of individual savings. So what does the study explore and what were the lessons learned? Well, we looked at a number of reforms, and what we find is that the defined benefit plans were retained, albeit at a reduced level. Hybrid designs, including defined contribution add-ons, were a common approach to helping employees make up that difference between what the DB plan will now replace and what it had in the future, and what the individual actually needs to have an adequate retirement. Limited shifts to defined contribution plans as the primary retirement arrangement. Yes, it has happened, but it is not the norm. What we've really seen is that defined benefit plans continue to be the core benefit, with a defined contribution option or enhancement to the plan. We also looked at savings behavior, and as most of you know, that's a challenge, getting people to understand what they need to change and actually taking the action to do it. So inertia we found to be a problem in the area of getting folks to save for retirement. We also looked at the lifetime income options. There's a lot of criticism on the DC side that the benefits are not structured to provide lifetime income, and there are a lot of new approaches out there that can help with that goal. And also, what's the role of the employer in providing lifetime income products for their employees? Meaning that there are ways that employers can bring these services and products to their employees and also negotiate the fees around those products so that they are more affordable. We're going to move to a polling question. Heather, we're ready for our first question.
Okay, you may proceed.
While you're looking at this question, which is over the past 5 years, has the government you work for or with made changes to their retirement plan? And then second part, have these changes decreased the value of the defined benefit plan for current and or future employees? Again, we just wanted to make sure that you had access to, just to remind you while you're voting, have access to the full report, and again, that can be found on either the NAGDA website or the slge.org website. So we're now waiting for those responses.
So Kathy, it looks like the results are now showing on the right side of the screen.
Okay, so for our first, what we're showing is that of the 29 of you are saying yes, the changes have been made, and that 13 of you are saying no, and that we have some no answers. So kind of a mixed approach in response to both A and B. So remember that A talked about have you made changes, and B was did those changes reduce the value of the DB plan. So with that, we're going to move to Josh. He's going to pick it up and start to talk about the fiscal or financial condition of state and local pension plans.
Thank you, Kathy. This is Josh Franzel. The slide that you have in front of you right now, state and local pension funded ratios, is a slide that comes from a recent brief that our center and the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College released called The Funding of State and Local Pensions 2011 to 2015. I wanted to sort of cover a couple things about this slide and some data that sort of backs it up. As you can see from this slide, the aggregate funding ratios of public pension plans in 2011 was an estimated 75%. Now, this is down from 87% prior to the Great Recession in 2007, and it was 100% aggregate 100% funded ratio back in 2000. While markets have bounced back significantly since their 2009 lows, given that most plans phase in investment gains and losses over a 5-year time period in order to reduce volatility in contribution rates, aggregate funding ratios continue to slide, as you can see. That said, our colleagues at Boston College's Center for Retirement Research estimate aggregate funding ratios will increase to 82% by 2015 under a most likely scenario of moderate economic recovery translating to stocks raising about 8% annually. Now, should markets not grow at all over the next 3 years, the aggregate funding ratios would be around 74%. And in a very optimistic scenario, and I bold very here, market growth of 16% would over the next 3 years would translate to aggregate funding ratios of about 98%. Also of note, given the generally flat revenue growth governments have experienced since the end of the Great Recession, coupled with increased demand for public services, in 2011, according to SLGE and Boston College's Public Plans database, state and local governments in the aggregate paid 79% of their pension plan's annual required contribution. Now, this is relative to when they paid 100% back in 2001 and 92% just back in 2008. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, while aggregate funding ratios are estimated at about 75%, all plans are not in the same position. As the chart in front of you shows, there's a wide range of funding levels in plans across the country. About 47% of all these plans are somewhere between 60 and 79% funded. Just to add a little bit more context, examples of some of the plans that are 100% and overfunded, 100% and above funded would be plans in Washington, D.C. and Washington State. Plans in Wisconsin, Delaware, Idaho, North Carolina, and South Dakota, among others, found themselves funded somewhere between 80% and 99%. On the other end of the spectrum, examples of plans that are funded in the 40 to 59% range include plans in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. Plans in Illinois and Kentucky have ratios between 20% and 39%. So as you can see, it's a mixed bag and it's a wide range of funded ratios out there across the country. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So given the underlying challenges many of these plans face, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 44 states enacted major changes in state retirement plans for many groups of employees between 2009 and 2012. The graph in front of you reflects data over a 4-year time period starting back in 2008. So let's walk from the left to the right of this slide here. Some of the most common changes have been to suspend or otherwise alter cost of living adjustments for current or future retirees. This change that is sometimes attached to funding levels of the plan or inflation. Examples of states that have made adjustments to COLA include South Dakota in 2010, which now bases COLAs on both plan funding levels and CPI, and Minnesota in 2010 and New Jersey in 2011, which associate COLA with plan funding levels. Other changes include increasing employee contributions to plans for new and existing employees. Examples of this change would be, in 2011, Alabama increased contribution rates for new and existing employees in stages over a period of time, and Maryland, which also increased contributions for new and existing employees. And this is among many other states. Some states, like Pennsylvania and California, for example, have linked these contribution increases to plan funding. Many states have also reduced benefits for new hires by lowering multipliers used in calculating the pension benefit. This change has often been coupled with higher vesting requirements, longer service requirements, and later retirement ages for new hires. Also, a few states have made major structural change by switching to a hybrid plan, which Paula will talk about in a little bit, and smaller DB plans, hybrid plans being smaller DB plans coupled with a DC plan. Examples include Utah in 2010 closed the DB for all employees and gave them a choice of DC or hybrid plan. Rhode Island did something similar in 2012. Kansas, Louisiana, and Virginia also replaced their DB traditional pension plans with cash balance plans for new hires. Now, simply put, many of these changes reduce and possibly eliminate the value of the traditional defined benefit plan for various cohorts in the state and local public sector. So I now want to turn the call over to Paula Sanford, who will walk us through some of the key considerations linked to the evolving role of DC plans in the public sector. Paula?
Thank you, Josh. Great. Thank you, Josh. I think it's important as we think about these changes and talk about them that they be examined from this idea of income adequacy. Will people have enough money to retire? And you look at the changes to the DB or switch to a hybrid, and then they have to consider, well, how much additional personal savings that can be garnered through a supplemental DC will they need? So when we think about income adequacy, it's typically as a ratio of how much they earned while they were working, and it's to maintain the same standard of living in retirement that you had while working. The traditional benchmark has been, and by the way, when we think about income adequacy, it's all financial resources, Social Security, pension, personal savings. The traditional range of 80 to 85% still works, but it's based on these key assumptions that you see, that the retiree doesn't have debt, that they own their own home, they're in good health, and they have adequate health care to afford to retire. Some argue that it can be low as 70%, we heard in our research, but those are based on some very key assumptions, those we just talked about, as well as not having children or grandchildren living with them, and recognizing that they're going to have a very simple lifestyle, that they're going to have simple hobbies, they don't plan on traveling, and that they have good retiree health insurance. However, that isn't the environment for a lot of our retirees today. A lot of them are going into retirement without owning their home. They may have credit card debt. This idea of children moving back in and living with them or grandchildren, as well as some serious concerns about rising health care costs and the future of Medicare. Because of these issues, some argue that 90 to 100% ratio is more appropriate. And I think what this shows is that individuals need to think about the retirement and that they need to have individual retirement plans. The 80 to 85% is a great benchmark when someone is starting out working, but 10 years out, they need to be working with a financial planner to look at what they need to change, where their lifestyle, their financial situation is at, and then what do they need to do to prepare for retirement, save more, or perhaps even work longer. Next slide, please. So to help people with savings, this idea that if DB plans aren't going to be quite as generous as they used to be, that we need to create plans that help encourage savings, this idea of an outcome-based plan design. Looking at the private sector experience and getting people to be successful, as well as the field of economics that has looked at behavior, has kind of come up with what we can do. Behavioral economics has looked at why people don't save or why they save poorly, and it happens for many reasons, including inertia, overvaluing immediate consumption, overvaluing losses over potential savings, and even following a path of least resistance, i.e., we're just going to go with what's easiest. And so we need to create plans that overcome or at least minimize these limits for people to help them achieve their goals. And what we see is that in creating an outcome-based plan design, there are kind of three goals that are embedded in that. The first, of course, is obvious: increase savings with appropriate investment strategies. How can we have investment instruments and investment help with them? The second should be to limit leakage. And by leakage, I'm referring to defaulted loans or withdrawals. And then the third is fostering communication between the employee and between plan counselors, between plan record keepers, and even, and especially in smaller governments, and plan administrators, if you're helping them to help encourage their savings and prepare them for retirement. Next slide, please. So what we're talking about here with the supplemental plan design, these are some approaches that are this outcome-based design. So what are the elements that may be involved? And the first that I'm going to talk about is auto-enrollment. And the first, important to remember that auto-enrollment may or may not be appropriate in a supplemental plan based on what your traditional DB looks like. So auto-enrollment, kind of as a background for some of you, is when you automatically enroll an employee in a DC plan and they have to opt out. And the goal of that is that because of inertia, people just stay in the plan. And it is found to be extremely successful. For some research has found that up to 90% of the people stay in plans once they're auto-enrolled. So then whether or not it's needed and at what level. If you have your DB plan continues to have a fairly generous multiplier, but you feel that because of changes in your retiree health care or in your COLAs in the future that you want to encourage savings, you may want to do auto-enrollment, but at a much lower percent, say 1%. But then you need to think about these issues involved with administrative costs for you and some of those issues. But if you have a hybrid plan, then it may be appropriate to have a higher auto-enrollment level, say maybe 3 or 4%. Research has even found that was done in a private sector core DC plan that auto-enrollment can be as high as 5 or 6% before you start seeing a significant drop-off in participation. Now, in terms of thinking about what the plan looks like and in terms of investment choices, the research has found that people generally do better with a limited number of funds, that they can be overwhelmed with too many funds. Through our interviews, we found a significant range from as low as 6 to as many as 20, with the target date being considered one fund. It's important to have a balance of assets and amongst the different classes. Once in a while, we did hear that in a supplemental fund, to encourage participation, it is helpful maybe to have some well-recognized funds so people can look them up on the internet and research them more to increase their comfort level. And then finally, of course, was the strong support for a target date fund. Because it is managed, it takes care of people's inertia, makes them more comfortable because they don't know how to invest or they don't have that expertise. And so it was liked. But it is managed, so there are fees, so there's some more fiduciary responsibility on the government. And because of some of that responsibilities, because they are they can be volatile, some others like the stable value funds for a target date fund. But generally, the vast majority of the people we spoke with in our interviews prefer the target date fund, and it is the most widely used default fund. In terms of a brokerage window that's growing in popularity as people want to do their own investments, although governments offer it, it tends to only have a few percentage of employees who take advantage of it. But the key to remember, that goal is to increase savings. That's why we have these accounts. So it's appropriate to have some limits. For example, you may want to limit that it is just for mutual funds, that they're not there to play the stock market, that they can only have a percentage, that they need to keep a certain minimum amount in their account, the primary account, before they can use the brokerage window. Some other issues are having a limited number of record keepers, no more than 3, with 1 being the most popular number, and that is to help with coordination for the person's investments, and also to avoid a record keeper having an incentive to perhaps recommend or suggest that an employee invest in their accounts or their portfolios. And then finally, have loans. Loans are often seen as a way to encourage participation, but that doesn't mean they can't be limited. You can limit in terms of if you've defaulted, you can't have another one, and you can also limit that you have to have a certain percentage of money in your account before you can have a loan. And you can also try to encourage repayment, because repayment is always better than a default. And some examples that we learned about were things like allowing people to even repay after they've left the government if they've left, or just thinking about ways of being more flexible to help the employee. Next slide, please. Now, for core DC plans, many of the ideas are similar in terms of an outcome-based design as a supplemental. And when we talk about these ideas, we looked at it from a perspective of generating income adequacy in retirement. Now, we recognize that governments have multiple goals, one of which is to save money, and that they have to balance that with having employees receiving a secure and adequate income in retirement. But our number goal was income adequacy. So as you review these, that's where our perspective came from. The first thing we would argue is that contributions need to be 12 to 15% of salary. That's if they also contribute to Social Security, and if not, it needs to be as high as 18 to 20%. We would suggest the employer contributes half of that, or the amount that they contribute to the DB plan for equity, and that employee contributions are mandatory, and that they're actually set at the full amount right when they start, so that auto-escalation is not necessary. If employees know that they have to pay and they know that as terms of employment, then you might have less frustration with it or pushback. We also, in terms of, again, since there are mandatory contributions, that the default would be a target date fund to overcome people's inertia and to ensure that there's an adequate distribution of the money across all the asset classes and that they're appropriately moved over time. We would say that vesting is 1 year or less. Many people would prefer immediate vesting, but because of turnover, we recognize that that might be administratively cumbersome, and it also might encourage people to stay a little bit longer and at least get them through their probationary period. We think that it's important, especially with a core DC plan, that they have an annuity option, that because they're going to need lifetime income, that the governments help them recognize this need. And then some of the other very similar investing strategies that you had with the supplemental plan, such as a slightly larger fund menu, 10 to 15 funds, but these would include all asset classes, maybe some lower cost funds such as index funds, and that you may also want to broaden the fund base with some higher risk, such as even a real estate fund. That again, loans are limited. In this case, loans might not be allowed on the employee portion. It's kind of, as the employer, you contribute that money, you do have some say on how it's used. In this case, we would recommend one record keeper. And as for the brokerage window, while it might still be an option, again, you could say you can't use the employer contributions to play the stock market. So, and also put similar limits such as a minimum balance and only to mutual funds. Because again, the goal is always to increase savings. Next slide, please. Great. So we had talked about this annuity option and the growing importance of annuities. Now, annuity under a traditional DB plan, if it's a 2% multiplier and they have Social Security and they work for 30 years, they wouldn't need an annuity. But if you think about people in a core DC or even in a hybrid plan, that might become more and more important. So we found strong support for annuities, particularly in a core DC environment. So some of the ways or different annuity products that are coming out to address historical concerns with annuity, such as their costs, such as at times being perceived as inflexible or concerns over just general concerns of employees, is the first is this what's called a guaranteed minimum withdrawal benefit. And minimum guaranteed withdrawal benefit is a variable annuity with a guaranteed floor. It has retained flexibility in that if money is left in the account after the person person passes early, that money can have bequest. A person can also withdraw money if they need to in cases of an emergency. However, that may result in a downward adjustment of their guaranteed base. But conversely, if the investments do really well, then you can your base may actually increase. And finally, it can opt to be portable. So that increases kind of the security of what happens if the insurance company doesn't do well. The second is an advanced life deferred annuity. And basically, that's purchasing annuity that would kind of kick in much later in life. So someone in their 50s or 60s would buy an annuity that would take effect at around 70, 75, maybe even 80. Because they're deferred life, they're relatively inexpensive, and they do provide against longevity risk. So if you have even a traditional DB, but you're worried that cost of living the COLA won't really keep up with true cost of living, or if you have employees who are doing a systematic withdrawal method on a DC plan, that they don't run out of money. So this is a nice kind of safety net for those types of options. The third is a trial annuity that it's starting to be used in core DC plans, and that's basically where a portion of the employee's retirement money is invested in an annuity, in a deferred annuity. Upon retirement, the annuity kicks in, and the employee has the option of withdrawing from the annuity without penalty. The thinking is that an employee will start receiving the annuity, like it, and continue using it. It's basically kind of takes that inertia to have them have the annuity and the guaranteed income. Some of the concerns with that is that it does increase the fiduciary effort by the government in terms of making sure they've picked a good annuity and looked at the costs and continually evaluate the insurance company with the annuity. And then finally is a partial annuity and systematic withdrawal method. This is basically for a core, again, for a core DC plan that a person annuitizes part of their money, and then the rest of it they just use the partially withdrawing their assets from their liquid assets from their stocks and bonds. So different options, and I think these will grow in importance or interest for those employees in hybrid plans when they get close to retirement, and for those who have moved to a core DC plan. Next slide, please. Finally, it's what can governments do to help employees understand annuities? They're complex financial instruments, and many people don't receive on their own the financial education to really know what to do and what is best for them. So there are basically 4 different actions that governments can take to assist employees interested in annuities. The first is offer an in-plan annuity. This would be likely less expensive to retirees than going to an insurance company themselves. However, the governments would need to carefully review and select the companies for the quality and cost. Some governments offer an annuity shopping service, and this is basically a platform that provides competitive bids of annuities for employees. It's easier to buy an annuity from the employee this way, and there's kind of no liability or no fiduciary responsibility on the part of the government other than making sure they've had a good, they review the shopping service themselves. Employees are buying the annuity kind of out of plan, but they still may receive institutional pricing in some instances. There's government annuities are basically allowing your core DC employees to buy DB credits or buy into the DB plan upon retirement. A few governments do this. The state of Ohio is one. Under this arrangement, the government reassumes investment risk because they are now the annuitant. So the issue is that, you know, the government may have moved to a DC plan to reduce investment risk, and now they're taking it on again. So if a government is thinking about this option, the benefits to the employees are it's going to be cheaper, there's no risk of default, they get, you know, no profits, it's good for the employee. In terms of making it acceptable for the government, there may need to be a review of the discount rate. It may be in this case that the government should lower the discount rate to reduce its investment risk if it's going to take that back on. And then there are kind of the political issues and administrative issues, of course, that go along with that. And then finally, probably the most sufficient or the simplest action a government can take would be to offer annuity education. So you're not providing an annuity, but you're just telling employees what annuities are. You can do that in written form. You can do that in seminars, which provide that feedback with case studies and scenarios so that employees can work through the complexity of these instruments. You know, how much of annuity do they need? What is their overall financial package? What are these different cost scenarios? I mean, there are so many different types of annuities now in terms of thinking about all these different options, what works for them. It may be that in the future, with this evolving role of DC plans, employees may not know they need an annuity. And that way, government can also play a role by simply offering this education to them. And relatively speaking, it's lower cost and lower risk for the government. And in thinking about education, I'm going to give you back to Josh Frenzel, who's going to talk about overall financial education.
Well, thank you, Paula. I wanted to mention a few considerations about financial education as it relates to DC plans, and just as a side note, would encourage those of you listening today to read the financial literacy portion of the report. With traditional DB pension plans, more or less, one had to run a few calculations to determine how prepared they are for retirement. But with the evolving role of DC plans and their requiring more personalized decisions, there continues to be an increasing role for financial education among state and local workers. During the research phase of the report, some key thoughts about financial education often surfaced, and I wanted to touch on a few of them now. Well, first, governments should recognize that one-size-fits-all financial literacy programs often don't work. Depending on educational backgrounds and job responsibilities, among other factors, employees often approach financial decisions with varying degrees of financial understanding. Education programs should account for this. Also, for some segments of the workforce, providing materials and financial education modules online is the most effective way of reaching them. For others, in-person format works best. The research of the report also found that a key question for governments is about the topics to be covered in these financial education programs. Should the programs cover all aspects of an employee's financial life, like, for instance, retirement, rainy day savings, mortgage, college savings, and others? Or should the education be bound just to the financial benefits offered by the government employer? Now, this is a question that needs to be formally analyzed and answered by the government themselves when they're developing an education program. On the administrative side, governments should consider paying financial education specialists a salary, not a commission, and, if possible, have the specialists assigned to a specific government, not shared across governments. Both of these steps, we find, allow a more trusting relationship between the financial educator and the employees themselves. Also, governments should aim to bring financial education events to the employees at their place of work, and again, if possible, allow employees to attend the financial education sessions during their paid non-vacation time. This increases participation and incentivizes them to actually attend. Now, finally, I wanted to sort of step back and sort of mention a broader societal consideration that dovetails with state and local government financial education. The overall public's understanding or lack thereof of financial concepts and retirement preparation challenges are well documented. Given this and the fact that the 15 million person state and local government workforce exists in and interacts with members of all communities throughout the country, an opportunity does exist for financial education offered by governments and their employees to their employees to have an impact on the financial education levels of all Americans. So with that, I'd like to then open the next set of polling questions. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. So of the topics discussed during this presentation, which do you think is the most important to focus on when aiming to sustainably provide retirement security to your public workers? We'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Okay. Do we want to look at the results?
Josh, I think it's going to take a few minutes, so maybe as that's starting to come up, I want to thank both you and Paula for a really great insight into this issue of providing education, encouraging people to save, what some of the challenges are to do that, and what the design changes have been on the defined benefit side, and how that impacts the discussions that employers should be having with their employees about how they make up the gap between what was provided and what will be provided and what they will need in the future for retirement. I'm going to turn it over to Heather now, and she's going to talk. We're going to move into the Q&A section. Although, Josh, I see that it looks like some of the results are up, even though there's a little more time to respond. Do you want to walk through what the results
Sure. I see that of the 105 participants, the most 45 didn't have an answer, but 17 of the 105 listed income adequacy. The financial education being the second most important piece to the group, and followed closely by recognizing the role of a DC plan and lifetime income. I know from it's heartening to see the importance of financial education as I look at this being the number 2 most popular. I don't know, Paula, do you have any comments on that?
Well, what I found interesting too is that so many of the things are really important. And it shows that retirement income is multifaceted. There are a lot of things to consider, which is making it challenging for so many of our participants here today, and so many different things that need to be considered as we evolve and think about retirements for our employees.
Just one other comment about sort of the role of DC plans in general is that one thing that is often overlooked is, especially with increased vesting requirements, my colleagues at the center and those we work with often talk about how what we often don't think about is that relatively short tenured individual that may be eligible for a defined benefit plan, but ultimately doesn't stay long enough to vest, and in some cases you need 10 years to vest in these plans. And how do you position that employee that might not stay for that in maybe in a case 10 years to be able to stay for retirement and be able to take at least something with them? And so that you see that a lot in the education arena, and it certainly highlights the need for increased attention to DC plans in the public sector.
Right, and that element that the DC plan does bring is a higher level of portability, which is, as you said, for shorter-term employees is an important aspect, particularly if you're looking at hybrid plans. Having that element of affordability is important to the overall retirement adequacy. Well, Paula, again, and Josh, thank you. Just to note that on the screen are contact information for all of us. If you have additional questions after we end our Q&A session. And I'm going to turn it over to Heather so she can remind you how to ask a question, and we have a couple in queue right now.
As a reminder, you may ask a question through your web console. Locate the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. Type in your question and click Send to submit. Kathy, I will turn things back over to you.
Thank you, Heather. The first question we have is around annuities, and it's asking, you know, what are the differences between an in-plan annuity and a government annuity?
I'll go ahead and answer that. An in-plan, when I was talking about an in-plan annuity, that would basically be still a private sector insurance company who sells the annuity. It's just you get institutional pricing because it's being offered through the government. Maybe a weak analogy might be your health insurance, right? So you buy your health insurance or you receive your health insurance through your employer, but it's really, the insurance company is really Blue Cross Blue Shield. When I talked about a government annuity, the government is the one supplying the annuity, just like the DB form. It's just that in this case, the employee comes with a pot of cash that says, I want to buy an annuity from you, government. I hope that answers it.
Well, you know, certainly on the DB side, it's what we would refer to as self-annuitized. The system performs the annuity function so that when you retire, you get your periodic payment. And you could think about that as a form of annuity. It's a lifetime benefit. It is based on a formula, but it is paid out by the plan, and the plan continues to invest the pension assets to help pay for those benefits. So there is a form of, you know, in-plan annuity already on the DB side, and so this may be something to look at for the DC plans as well. There's actually, the state of North Carolina has a program that they've set up for their 457 plan where the participants can go to the state credit union, and the credit union provides a very low-cost annuity. It's something like $100 to buy in. So that if you're living in the state of North Carolina, that might be and you're in the 457 plan and you're looking to annuitize, that might be something you want to look at. So there are examples out there. The next question is, could you describe the elements of a hybrid plan and how those elements work together? So what are the pieces of the plan and how do they work together and complement each other? Josh, sure. Do you want to start out?
Sure. A hybrid plan, take it, depending on how you're defining it, it can be a couple of different approaches, but generally speaking, you have a smaller, less generous defined benefit component that alongside also has a defined contribution component where the employer and the employee potentially contribute. So you have two that typically sit right next to each other, where you get a smaller guaranteed benefit from the defined benefit component, and then you have a smaller defined contribution component that, just like core DC plans, fluctuates with the value of the assets that are held in the account. I'd just like to point out a couple things. Our center has a primer on hybrid plans. It's available through slge.org. And then also the National Association of State Retirement Administrators has also released a brief or two about the different approaches states and some localities have taken for hybrid plans. Just one side note is that some folks also referred to cash balance plans as hybrids as well. With cash balance plans, in this type of plan of a defined benefit plan, employers guarantee an annual rate of return on a notional account into which the employer, the employee, or both contribute. the account must at minimum be must meet the guaranteed rate, which may be set as a percentage or some multiplier of an indicator, such as a yield on a treasury bill. At retirement, the employee can withdraw the funds through an annuity or in one lump sum. But because a cash balance plan is a defined benefit plan, the employer is ultimately responsible to fund the plan so that the benefit obligation is funded. And folks often refer to cash balance plans as hybrid as
well. Thank you. We have a question on annuities, and it is, how much more costly are the guaranteed minimum withdrawal benefit annuities, and does the individual participant primarily bear the cost, or is the cost scaled up and borne by the system or by the plan?
These are relatively new instruments, and it is a little bit more costly than just having a variable annuity to have that guaranteed base. I think like anything else, I don't want to be wrong, but I think it's at least a percentage point. But you would need to call, and as somebody interested in that would need to go around. And I think in terms of the cost being borne, it would be the same as any kind of pooled insurance product. In terms of the insurance company looks at your age, they look at your lifestyle. Did you want to have the floor transferred to a spouse? All those different issues, and then is it the cost of the annuity is shared, but it would be treated the same as any insurance product. Kathy, if you want to please add more.
I was just going to say, kind of the role of the plan in any of these annuity options is to negotiate the best rates possible for the participants. So the goal is always to be providing these annuity options at a group rate. And that's, as these annuity products start to develop, that's an important role for the employer, and to be able to explain, what the benefits are of each type of approach.
I mean, right now an individual can go into the private sector and buy an individual guaranteed minimum withdrawal benefit.
Right.
So as well, and you as an individual will have an individualized, you will have a cost, and the insurance company does their actuarial basis for the value of that cost.
We have an additional question, and it really has to do with kind of putting your crystal ball into action. It's, do you expect to see more of a shift to core DC plans so that the DC plan is the primary plan that a state or local government would be offering?
I'm not very good at reading crystal balls, but one thing I would comment on is a lot of times you hear the increased interest in converting over to a defined contribution plan in an environment where the traditional defined benefit plan is severely underfunded. And one thing that we often point out is that just because you convert over doesn't eliminate any liabilities that are attached to your already pre-existing defined benefit pension plan. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. There are a couple other considerations as well. So, Paul, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but I don't. My crystal ball is a bit foggy.
I think you brought up a really core issue, Josh, and in terms of thinking about it and planning, in terms of this isn't something that, and it needs to be looked at, you need to plan for it, and shouldn't just be a political gut reaction. And you need to think about your recruitment and retention. The Gwinnett County, which was one of our case studies, they moved to a core DC plan. They closed it for new employees, and it was part of a larger pension reform effort that they were doing. And they did their recruitment studies against and looked at where that pension would be against their competitors and other counties. so that they could recruit and retrain. They had a funding plan in place in terms of, so, you know, because they had an unfunded liability and they're paying both, and how can they manage that? The recession did a hiccup on that, but they're meeting their goals. So this isn't a quick solution, and while it may save your government money, whether or not it does is really dependent upon how you establish your DC plan and what your contribution levels are.
And I think that's a good point. You know, when we talked about contribution levels to a core DC plan, in order to get a meaningful benefit, if you're covered under Social Security, it's 12 to 15% of payroll, and without, it's 18 to 20. And when you look at the average contribution that employers make, I mean, we have more private sector information than public sector here, but it's basically about a 3% from the employer with a 3% match from the employee, so you're at 6. So that's a concern, is whether the plans will really provide an adequate coverage. So the design is extremely important going forward. I think over the years, too, that there's been a number of times when the thinking was that public plans are going to make a swift move to defined contribution plans, and that certainly was the discussion right after the market downturn in 2008 and 2009. And what we've actually seen is the reform that's gone forward has retained the DB plan as the core in most every case, even though that during the debate and looking at the reform, there likely had been a discussion of doing a conversion to a DC plan. And as Josh points out, that does nothing to get to eliminate or to pay down the legacy cost of the existing defined benefit plan, and can actually make the unfunded status of the DB plan worse, because there's transition costs when you move to a DC plan as your core plan. And so cooler heads have prevailed. I do think we're going to see another round in this year's legislatures. There are a number of states where we've already seen defined contribution core plans being suggested, and it remains to be seen if the same process will occur, where when you start to look at the issue and price it out and look at how you may be able to make changes to the defined benefit side, that it's more likely that we'll continue to see an approach of more hybrid plans that, again, uses the DB plan as the core. However, it's going to replace less, and therefore there's a DC component which encourages people to save on their own to get to that adequacy level. I think we have time for maybe one quick question before we go. We're getting close to the 2 o'clock hour, or the end of the session, depending on what time zone you're in. And this is really a hybrid type question. What's the difference between a stacked and a parallel hybrid plan? Paula, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I'll go ahead and answer that. Basically, when you think about parallel plans, those are probably, that's what's most common, and what you see where you have every employee receives the same benefit, the same DB benefit, and if there's a match on the DC side, they would receive the same benefit regardless of income. But some argue that perhaps for equity reasons, for reasons about ability to save, that instead of having these two parallel, DC and DB plans, what you have is a stacked plan. And the stacked plan says, we're going to give you a DB multiplier up to a salary cap. So it might be 1.5% or 2% up to, say, and this is totally arbitrary, $35,000. And everybody, regardless of your income, receives that. And after that, it's purely supplemental. So if you make $50,000, you would only receive your multiplier based on a salary of $35,000. And then you would have supplemental or your DC savings make up the difference to reach that income adequacy goal that you need. And there may be a match on top of that, you know, that you could get, but it's a maximum amount of DB based on a salary cap.
Just one other data point or a place to go for more information on that. Our center released with Boston College an issue brief in 2011 titled "A Role for Defined Contribution Plans in the Public Sector" that outlines at least one way of approaching a stacked plan.
Thanks, Josh.
We have one quick, I just want to not leave it on the table, one last question. And it basically is, what approaches have you seen that are most effective in helping members understand their projected total income in retirement? So, you know, including DB, their personal savings, and Social Security. And I would say that benefit statements where you can provide combined information, calculators that help people go in and look at and estimate what their retirement savings may be, and then really talking about saving early and saving often. And certainly automatic enrollment, automatic escalation have been really helpful tools. Paula or Josh, do you have a final word on that?
Oh, just one thing about, from a defined contribution perspective, several vendors I've seen have done a great job with apps and websites where you type in a bit of information about your finances and gives you a really nice snapshot of where you are position-wide in preparing for retirement. But I think there are several good models out there.
And some of them do incorporate things like anticipating a DB and what that, you know, what basically your annuity would be and what your income is, so what you would expect from Social Security, and then tells you how much you need to be saving or change your savings to reach an income goal.
Well, I want to thank both our speakers today, and thank you all for hanging in there. There were over 105 of you today, so thank you for your strong response to this webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vicki, are we back in the subconference?